Over several years, I've been greatly helped and blessed by the books and resources that have come out of the great ministry of practical shepherding. And it's been a great joy over the last year to begin to get to know Brian a little bit personally. And I was so grateful when he agreed to talk with me about the work of preaching. I'm sure you're going to enjoy this conversation we had recently.
Yeah. So, Brian, once again, I mean, I'm very grateful to you for taking the time. Can you just give us a quick sort of resume of your ministry preaching experience, just to introduce yourself to folk?
Yeah, so my name is Brian Croft, and I was been a pastor for the last 25 years. So I did about 8 years of associate pastor work in a few different churches, which had all kinds of roles to it, from preaching and teaching to leading music. So I'm a musician. That's an aspect of ministry that I did for several years. And then I went to be the senior pastor of Auburndale Baptist Church in Louisville, Kentucky. And I was the lead pastor there for 17 years. And so went into a very typical Baptist church in the U.S., which required me to preach Sunday morning, Sunday night, and Wednesday night, all new different sermons. Yeah. So I know, John, I have to preface that because the young guys are like, what are you talking about? So you have more than one sermon to do. So, but those of us who are old enough remember that's pretty normal in a lot of churches. Yeah, been there. So that was a wake up call to have to, I mean, obviously trying to figure out how to preach in those years, still trying to figure, the terminology I use is still trying to find my preaching voice, which I believe takes about 400 or 500 sermons to really find your preaching voice. And so I was still in that process. And I'm an expository preacher. So I was preaching through one book in the morning, I preached through another book in the evening, I'm writing 2 manuscripts, I'm teaching Bible study on Wednesday nights. So that was a lot to try to figure that out while I'm trying to do it. And for those who know my story, to try to do it in a pretty hostile environment. So that church I went to, the short version is there were 3 different movements to get me fired in the first 5 years of the church, and threats of violence against me. And the pastoral search team that hired me was slandering my name 3 years out after being there around the community. And church ran out of money. My health started tanking. That's all in the first 5 years. And by God's grace, the ship turned, and in year 6, the church started to flourish. And for the next 10 years, I was still there another 10, 12 years. And but that environment, trying to learn how to preach and to preach that much, and some of the hostility that I faced was towards my preaching. In the 80-year history of the church, there'd never been an expository preacher before. Yep. So I'm trying to learn how to preach. I'm preaching in an environment, it's not being well received, and I'm trying to find my own voice as a preacher. So those are some hard years. Yeah.
And then you set up this ministry of practical shepherding. And which now you're full time in,
right? So practical shepherding started out of that local church ministry. So just training some young guys for the ministry, just realizing I'm in Louisville, Kentucky. There's a big seminary, a good seminary in Southern Seminary there, but learning that seminaries theologically train you, but they do not teach you how to be pastors. Yeah. So just realizing that was my responsibility as a local church pastor to train these guys on how to be pastors, and part of that was teaching guys how to preach. So practical shepherding came out of just teaching guys the practicalities, from how do you preach to how do you do a hospital visit to how do you do a funeral. And so practical shepherding grew out of those early years of the church, and it just continued to grow, and it just kept growing to where one of the reasons I transitioned out 2.5 years ago was to lead practical shepherding full time. So I left pastoral ministry after 25 years being in it, to lead practical shepherding full time, which is what I'm continuing to do right now. Excellent. I also have a role at Southern Seminary. I lead the Church Revitalization Center there. So those are my two roles now. Yeah. But practical shepherding is my full-time role. Sure,
that's great. Brian, looking about, how did you sense personally God's call on your life to be a preacher? How did that come about?
So I was at college. I was university, and felt some call in the ministry. I didn't know how to sort through it. So I didn't have a good local church. I didn't have a pastor who was working with me. So I felt very alone in that process, trying to sort through that. Here's what I knew. I knew I loved Jesus and I loved people. That's about all I knew. I didn't know the word well at all. So I didn't know how to preach. I didn't know how to think through those categories. Hadn't gone to seminary. And so I ended up just going back on staff at a church in my hometown that I got offered at 20 years old. And it was not a good church. It was not a healthy church. So that was a mess to try to sort through. So my early years of ministry were really hard, just because I had no one really helping me sort through what my calling was. And God was really gracious, because I was young, I was immature, I didn't know the word, and I didn't have good mentors that were guiding me. So I really could have just derailed as quick as I started. And God really preserved me in a very unhelpful and unhealthy environment. And so I learned a lot of ministry, just sorting through my calling by just doing a lot of ministry in an unhealthy church. But it was in a local church. We were busy doing a lot of work, and I learned early how much ministry is so much about, is about people and loving and caring for people and those things. But did not sit under good preaching, did not get pastorally mentored well. So that eventually came. I learned things the hard way. I made a lot of mistakes. But eventually what happened is the Lord just did a transformative work in my life, to where I grew to love the word. So I started just devouring it hours a day for years. And that was just transformative. The Lord did an amazing work in my heart, which then began to help shape, okay, what is this ministry called? It's about shepherding. It's about ministering the word. I didn't know that at the beginning. And then God brought some really important mentors, pastoral mentors, into my life. I wasn't serving with them at the churches I was in, but they came along, and I told them, I was like, you just saw where the state I was in, and you took pity on me. And I think that's still to this day, that's what they did.
Sure. Yeah.
And they basically mentored me. They taught me about what it meant to be a pastor. They taught me about what does it really mean to shepherd, what it really mean to minister God's word, and what is a healthy church, not necessarily a church that has a lot of activities, but what is church health? So having some mentors come along, God used that to totally change the trajectory of my ministry.
Sure. Yeah. So you didn't have a sort of strong pastoral example, role model, if you like. Who are the men who began to influence you, really shaped you, and in a sense made you the preacher you are today? Who are the great influences on your life?
So I'd have to start with Mark Dever. Mark Dever, my brother went to Mark's church maybe a year after Mark went to Capitol Hill. So I met Mark in the early years. And and Mark just took me in. Mark, before he was kind of this evangelical rock star that he's known as now, he wasn't that. He just was a local church pastor and loved young guys. And he just saw me. He saw two things. I think he saw I was gifted for ministry early on in my relationship with him, and he saw how horribly just naive I was and didn't know what I didn't know. And he's one of the guys I think took pity on me for the sake of his friendship with my brother. And Mark invested in me for a good 10 years. I never went there, it was all long distance, but I had family in DC where he lived. He came for trustee meetings at Southern. So he and I spent a lot of time together, even though we never lived in the same city. And Mark just really had a huge impact on me. He taught me what a pastor really is. He taught me what a local church is supposed to be. Obviously, everybody knows Mark to be that guy. Well, and just God's kindness, I was one of the beneficiaries in the early years of that. In a way, I don't think he could invest in a guy like me now, just because of how much his ministry's grown. But so I was there in some of those early years and benefited from Mark. A second guy I met is a guy named Jackson Boyette, who truly became probably my closest mentor and most influential teacher. He really became a father figure. He became really the closest thing I ever had to a pastor, because I never had a pastor growing up. All the churches we were a part of, the pastors just didn't see themselves in that shepherding role. So this guy, Jackson Boyette, was a pastor in Austin, Texas, and we just met through a mutual friend, and God, just really providential meeting. He wanted a young guy to pour into, and I needed a guy to help me in these early years of being a pastor at Auburndale and dealing with all the hostility that I was dealing with. So he and his wife were killed by drunk drivers 10 years ago.
Wow.
And so that was a devastating loss. But I have to say, he probably more than anybody, he and Mark are the two of the most influential by far in shaping me in the early years. And since then, when Jackson passed, the Lord brought some other men into my life out of that. I just knew the value of older men needing to. So some in the UK. So Austin Walker became a dear friend and a mentor. Bill Hughes. I'm sure some of you guys in Britain will know these names. But Bill Hughes and Austin Walker just became such incredible influences in my life and shaped me in some wonderful ways. And they just, they were put at the edge of retirement at that point, and they just graciously invested in me. And I love those men. So I feel like starting out without a mentor.
Yes.
At this moment in my life, I have had some really rich influences.
Okay, brilliant. Yeah. I got to know Bill. I never knew Austin. I got to know Bill, and I've got to know Jeremy Walker more recently. He's taught to the college a little bit as well. And he's lined up for one of these interviews in the coming weeks. So I
was going to tell you, Jeremy should be at the top of your list. He is one of the most gifted preachers in, I'd say, my generation. We're really good friends. But that's the Walkers are really an amazing, sweet family.
Yeah. I need to watch his revival package. I haven't seen that yet.
It's outstanding.
It will be. I'm sure it will be. It's got Jeremy's name on it. It'll be good. Yeah. So Brian, looking back, the way I frame this question, what advice would you now give your younger self, knowing what you know now? How would you advise yourself those years ago?
Oh man, that's a great question. There's a lot I could say. Here's the thing that leaps to my mind. Just the bar is supposed to be a faithful sermon. I think young guys, and I say this a lot, so that's why I'd say this is something I would say to my younger self. There are so many guys that think they have to preach some home run sermon every time they step into the pulpit. Like that's what's expected of them. Not just the congregation, but God expects that of them. It's just not true. I just don't believe that for a moment. And a lot of guys put a bunch of pressure on themselves unnecessarily to somehow. Now, we want to take this seriously. I mean, it's God's word. We need to bring it. And that it's God's word that builds the church. And so I breathe life into the church. I fully believe that. I've always functioned that way. But I see a lot of guys who get pretty insecure and even just paranoid about how they're going to preach and all the pressure they put on themselves. So if I could sit down with my younger self, I would sit down and look him in the eye and say, I know you feel all this pressure from all the celebrity preachers to all the guys around you who, think you're supposed to preach a certain way. Just be faithful to the text. Just trust the Spirit will be at work. I found Mark chapter 4 is the other thing I would share. The expectation of our preaching is not supposed to be Acts 2. It's supposed to be Mark 4. So the parable of the sower, Jesus specifically tells us how the word works. And it's like sowing seed, and then you sow the seed and you wait. And I think the illustration is brilliant that Jesus gives. Obviously, it's Jesus. He knows what he's doing and why he wants to capture it this way. But he captures the building of the kingdom. It's slow, it's subtle, it's hidden. And if you can realize the ministry of the word is slow, subtle, and hidden, but God's doing amazing, mysterious things in it. I find a lot of guys aren't nearly as discouraged about their preaching ministry. The problem is guys have this, we want all the opposite. We want quick and immediate and powerful and visible. And I read Mark 4, and that's the exact opposite. So I would tell my younger self, Mark 4 is your paradigm for what you should set for your expectation as a preacher. You sow the seed, you faithfully do that, and then you wait.
Yeah, that's the hard bit, isn't it? Yeah. You made the interesting point, which I think is so valid. In the internet world we live in today, the guys sitting in the pews of the local pastor are listening to MacArthur, they're listening to Piper or whoever else, and the pastor thinks they're measuring me by that standard or whatever else, and that's discouraging if you're just setting out and trying to hit, as you say, trying to hit that every Sunday.
Yeah, that's right. It's discouraging, and it's also not accurate.
No.
I think one of the things that I try to remind guys is well, because this is, in the internet age, this is, which is, by the way, this is brand new in the last 20 years, that pastors are having to feel an inferiority complex to the celebrity preachers everybody can go online and listen to.
Yeah.
But they're not their pastor. And I think that's
it.
The thing when a guy says, it's like, I know me, I'm an average preacher at best. How am I able to serve this congregation? And I tell them, because John MacArthur and John Piper they don't remotely know your flock like you do. Right. And so I emphasize a lot of, this is what pastoral preaching is.
Yes.
It's preaching with an aim for that particular flock. When 1 Peter 5, verse 2, Peter says, shepherd the flock of God that is among you.
Yes.
That's the call. That is the best summary in the New Testament of what the call of a pastor is.
Yeah.
And so there's nobody who can preach to your flock like you.
Yep.
So right. I find when guys can grasp that, the insecurity, the inferiority that they feel towards really gifted preachers who people listen to all the time, I just think it helps. It shapes. It's not to make them feel better. That's truly the nature of, I think, pastoral preaching in a local church, that you, knowing that flock best, are the best one to minister to them every Sunday, not some guy on the internet.
Yeah, amen. Absolutely. Yeah. Right. You probably keep a good awareness of what's going on in the evangelical preaching world, both sides of the water, as it were. What do you think is the greatest, or one of the great weaknesses? What do you notice is a trend, if you like, or that is not healthy, that needs addressing?
You're talking about just in preaching in general?
Yeah.
Well, I think I would answer that by just piggybacking a bit on what we were just talking about a minute ago. I think that we misunderstand what just normal, regular week in, week out preaching is. So I'll first say that. But here's the second thing I would say in light of your question. I think one of the major problems now, and it's a result of kind of this recovery of expository preaching and a high view of preaching, which we both would think is great.
Sure.
But there's actually a downside to that heightened importance of preaching, that a lot of guys come out of seminary, or they come out of Bible college, and they think ministry is all about preaching.
Yeah.
That's one of the biggest problems I'm finding. So it's, on one end, I'm glad there's a heightened importance towards preaching in a way I don't think there was 30 years ago.
Yeah. Yeah.
But one of the downsides, and I think it's a major downside, and a lot of people aren't talking about it, is guys don't shepherd.
Okay.
And I think that when we read the New Testament, everybody wants to go to 2 Timothy 4 and say, Paul tells Timothy, preach the word. That's the main call. Actually, it's not. 1 Peter 5 is verse 2 is the main call, I believe, of the pastor in the New Testament. You shepherd is the call. I would back that up with Acts 20. Paul's final words to the Ephesian elders is, pay careful attention to yourself and to the flock. That's the essence of the call of a pastor. It's not preaching. Preaching is important, and preaching is a big part of the shepherding call. But I would say people get them umbrellas mixed up. It's supposed to be an umbrella of shepherding, and preaching falls under it.
Yeah.
So the problem, to answer your question, the problem I see is people think the umbrella is preaching.
I understand. Yeah.
And everything falls underneath the preaching side. I do not believe that is what the New Testament points to.
Yeah.
Shepherding is the umbrella, and everything else falls underneath it. And so I think one of the main problems, again, a result of just a lot of good coming from the heightened importance of preaching, is people just don't shepherd. So young guys come out of seminary and they don't see themselves as the ones that actually have to go do the trench work, the grinding work of pastoral ministry, to go and visit the widows and go to the hospitals and do the funerals. They think they preach, they lead, and they farm it out to everybody else. And I think that is a massive mistake. And a lot of churches are being underserved in the way they're supposed to be, because pastors don't see themselves shepherding.
Sure. Yeah. So preaching is one of the ways in which you shepherd.
Exactly.
What you're saying, isn't it? Yeah.
And that's historically that's,
sure.
I mean, you read the Puritans. I mean, read Baxter in particular. Baxter's the one that pointed to the fact that, everybody talks about his home visit, regiment, and how intense it was, and it certainly was. But Baxter is the first one to say, why do you do all the home visits? I do them to help people hear my public preaching. And so I think there's a strong argument there that it all works together, but it ultimately comes down to, the sheep need to be felt loved by the shepherd. If they feel loved, they will follow him. They will listen to him minister the words in public and when he leads publicly and privately. And so I do, come on, John. I'm the practical shepherding guy. Nobody's shocked for me to say this, but I'm still going to push on it because I would love pushback on how what I just said is not the most accurate understanding of the pastoral call from the New Testament.
No, I appreciate that. I understand that. When it comes to actually preaching and preparation, the nuts and bolts as well as the delivery, what aspect of all of that, even after all these years, do you still find the most demanding, the most maybe you've got it all solved, Brian, I don't know, but what aspect particularly challenges you still as you come to the word all the time?
Well, I'm a musician, so I'll connect this illustration. The more you learn an instrument, the more you realize what you don't know.
Okay.
And what you have still to learn. And I think preaching is the same way. The more you learn, the better you get at it, the more you realize how much more there is to learn, how much more room there is to grow. And as I'm in this spot, 25 plus years of ministry, hitting middle age, that's definitely how I feel at this point. To answer your question, I would say there's a lot of places that I still feel are challenging. I will say this on a positive note, though, John, that there's a lot of aspects of preaching that are much easier than they were 20 years ago. Let me first say that. So for young guys saying like, I don't know if I can do this 20 years, there's parts that get easier that make the prep, flow better and those kind of things. But to answer your question, I would say the thing that I continually feel challenged by, I think anybody can really be taught how to make observations from a text and regurgitate those in some form or fashion. I think true, powerful, spirit-filled preaching comes in the application of those texts. So exposit well, preach the text well. But I think what is most challenging, and I feel like I will feel this rest of this is the area where it's kind of like the more I grow in this, more I don't know what I don't know. Realizing that is that, that pastoral, application, that specific application that truly comes from the text and that is thoughtfully and prayerfully being applied to that specific people that you're preaching to. And that is a craft. It's a skill. It requires a creativity that I think this is something that's missing in a lot of pastoral ministries, is just the embracing of needing to be creative. John, I think some of us are too afraid to be pragmatists, that we stifle creativity. And I just want to highlight, there's a big difference in my mind. There's a clear difference between pragmatism and just doing stuff for the sake of, let's see if this will work, to doing what you do convictionally, but being creative in it. I think being creative in your preaching to figure out how to, I think the way Bunyan describes just preaching to the heart and to get to those things that the Spirit of God really is going to use in that person's life. So I think that is still the most challenging part of preaching. And I think until guys realize that is, the hardest part, or one of the most challenging parts, guys who don't think that's hard, I would push them and say, then I don't think you see it as important enough. I watch guys who will do a 40-minute exposition and spend the last 4 minutes on application. And I just push back on that all the time. Like what? And when you ask them, they're like, well, I had to say all this in the text. It's like, actually, you don't. That's on you.
That's right.
Don't blame the text. Blame your poor preparation is what I would say.
That's right.
So pushing yourself to do the hard, I would say, prayerful work of how do you apply this to this group of people?
Sure. Yeah. I'm astonished when you look through and I did this deliberately a couple of years ago. You look through the books on preaching in the library, as it were, and you look up sort of application in the index or through the headings, and the absence is striking. All technical exegesis and structure, but application is just not there in a huge number of reputable books. It's astonishing.
Yeah, I agree. Matter of fact, when that's something I'm looking for in preaching books that are coming out, is it not only are you helping someone know how to do expository preaching, which I believe is the best way to just do a steady diet to preach it. not against topical sermons, but as
Sure.
far
No,
as a
no.
steady diet for a congregation.
I'm with you.
But how do you help somebody figure out how to apply the text they're preaching?
Yeah. I found Michael Fabre is very helpful on application. I think one of the best I've come across, but I'm sure there are others, but there's not that many, I have to admit.
Yeah.
If you want to get immersed in that,
That's great.
Yeah. Right. My last question was this. What one piece of advice would you give a preacher or would-be preacher, somebody just starting out, contemplating? What one piece of advice would you give them to guide them in those early stages?
Yeah, I would say make yourself preach shorter, not longer. So I think a lot of guys, again, I'm just context of coming out of seminary or Bible college or whatever it is, coming out with a lot of head knowledge, but not a lot of pastoral experience. Guys, and I think my favorite quote, I mean, I'm not gonna quote it exactly, but one of my favorite quotes on this is I heard Alistair Begg talk about once that guys come out they read Jonathan Edwards in seminary, and Edwards preached an hour, so they come out thinking they're supposed to preach an hour, and Begg's like, there's one problem, you're not Jonathan Edwards, and I thought,
yes,
that's very clever, and the only way he can say it. And so I would say that let's put it this way, when I was training young guys, I stressed to them to choose words very carefully. A lot of guys over prepare, and they do one of two things. They just preach a long time, and they're not skilled enough to preach a long time. I think there's only certain guys that really can. But the other part is what they do is then they try to fit it all in. So they talk too fast. They don't, they're not thinking about unction and projection and pronunciation. They're not thinking about having, deliberate pauses so that what you've just said, let it sit a moment before you keep going. So I think that the advice I give a lot of young guys is be mindful to choose your words carefully. Shorter is better than longer in general. And so what I used to do, John, is when I had young guys, we let a lot of guys preach on Sunday nights to test their gifts, let the congregation hear. And I made guys preach 20-minute sermons. And a lot of these are guys at seminary. They're going to preaching class at Southern Seminary, and they're just like, 20 minutes, what are you talking about? I can barely get into it. It's like, actually, that's part of your problem, is that's what you think. So, and all of them eventually got it, but they realized it's a lot harder to write a 20-minute sermon than a 40-minute sermon.
Oh, absolutely.
And so, but they all eventually understood, some to more frustrating levels than others. So that would be one of the main things I would say is choose your words carefully. An inexperienced preacher should preach shorter, not longer. And as you grow, you can increase the length. So as you grow as a preacher, you learn how to use that time better.
Yes.
So another thing I would say is, be willing to take a shorter passage, and spend the time there. And a lot of guys want to bite off a whole lot of passage, and then they have this conviction that somehow now I have to make a comment about every verse in there. So whatever their version of expository preaching is, and I would say, be very thoughtful and deliberate and discerning about how much of a text you choose to cover based on how long you want to preach and based on what you want to cover. The last thing I will say is, as you prepare, do not shortchange your application. But guys committed to exposition, I think it's the number one of the main mistakes they make, is that they feel like, I got to get all this in, and then I got this 5 minutes left for application. That's what I'll do. That is not a good choice in what to cut. So be mindful, plan out how much you're going to do of each one before you write your sermon. Last thing I would say, write manuscripts, but you need to. So I think just writing the manuscript of a sermon, especially early years, is smart and wise. But I think depending on your gifting, you should determine whether you take a manuscript or whether you whittle that down to a detailed outline. I'm not the guy that says you have to do it this way. I think everybody's gifted differently. I think that's part of mentoring, is you got to help somebody figure out how are they gifted, how are they not, and what's the better way for them to preach in a way that they can be very engaged.
That's right. Yeah, that's really helpful. I remember in my early days as a preacher, I tried to say everything I knew in one sermon. That was the great trouble. Pack it all in.
Yeah.
Of course, nobody gets anything that way.
That's problematic too. I agree, John. Yeah, that's right.
That's right. That's great. Brian, I really appreciate your time, my brother. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk this afternoon. And hopefully look forward to seeing you later on in the year when you're over on this side of the water.
Yeah, thanks. I'll be in Edinburgh, I think August 11th for an event there. So I would love to connect with you. But John, appreciate you and what you're doing there.
No, not at all. God bless you, my brother. All right.
Thank you.
That's the pattern of true faith, of true faithfulness. Because that is a pattern shaped by the Lord Jesus Christ.